Part 5, Section 2, Chapter 10 of Short History of the Christian Church by John Fletcher Hurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, The Presbyterian Church. No church has had a deeper influence on the life and thought of the United States than the Presbyterian. The Presbyterians claim as their first church the one organized in New Amsterdam, New York, in 1628, by the Reverend Jonas Michaelius, which, though a Reformed Dutch church, was Presbyterian in polity and doctrine. In fact, it was the first Protestant church organized in the New World, the church at Plymouth having been simply transplanted as an organization from Holland. There were many Presbyterians, indeed, in the Puritan immigration. Owing to the persecutions by the Episcopal governor of Virginia, Sir William Berkeley, the Presbyterians in that colony removed to Maryland, and settled on the site of the city of Annapolis. There Francis Doty, 1658, and Matthew Hill, 1667, preached to them. New England only narrowly escaped having a strong Presbyterian infusion. Divers gentlemen in Scotland, says Cotton Mather, wrote to the New Englanders at an early date to ask, "whether they might be suffered freely to exercise their Presbyterian church government," in the colony. An affirmative answer was returned. A storm at sea and adverse winds, which drove back the Scotch emigrants, prevented what might have been a most influential development in the history of New England. However, many of the early New England ministers were semi-Presbyterian, a golden mean, a "sweet sort of temperance between rigid Presbyterianism and leveling Brownism." Mather thought that the "heads of agreement" between the Presbyterian and Congregational ministers, drawn up in London in 1690, give a true description of "our ecclesiastical constitution." Writing to Robert Woodrow, a Scotch minister and historian, August 8th, 1718, he says, "We are comforted with great numbers of our oppressed brethren coming over from the north of Ireland unto us," referring to the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians driven out by prelatical fury. "They find so very little difference in the management of our churches from theirs and yours, as to count it next unto none at all. Not a few ministers of the Scotch nation, coming over hither, have heretofore been invited unto settlements with our churches." So strong did this Presbyterian contingent become, that as early as 1745 a presbytery was formed at Londonderry, New Hampshire. Francis Makemie, an Irish minister from Donegal, who came to America in 1681 in answer to a call for workers, was the real founder of the Presbyterian Church in America. Indefatigable, fearless of persecution, he went about Maryland and Virginia, establishing churches, encouraging the faint-hearted, bringing over ministers from the old country, and at length seeing the formation of the first presbytery in 1705 at Philadelphia. In 1716 the first synod was formed. The American Church was composed largely of Scotch-Irish and of Scotch people, who held firmly to the Westminster standards. To thwart any heretical tendencies, they determined to bind the Church to their home creed. In 1729 the synod passed the "Adopting Act," by which the Westminster Confession was made the symbol of the Church's faith, but in significant words whose meaning would be certainly pressed by the liberal wing of the Church. That confession was declared "as being, in all the essential and necessary articles, good forms of sound words and system of Christian doctrine," and it was also laid down that no one should be required to assent to articles "not essential and necessary to doctrine, worship, and government." Any strict construction of the terms of subscription became, therefore, impossible in American Presbyterianism. The Presbyterian Church, as Dr. Leonard Bacon remarked, is of easy cleavage. The first break took place in 1745. Its cause was the question of ministerial education and of revivals. The American section of the Church, as a rule, was in favor of earnest evangelical preaching, of aggressive methods, and of employing men who were well qualified in zeal and general gifts, even if their educational advantages had been meager. The Scotch section, on the other hand, held stubbornly to the slow and conservative ways of their fathers, and contended for a well-educated ministry. In 1726, William Tennant, a man of genuine apostolic mold, built in his parish at Neshaming, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a log house, the celebrated Log College, in which his sons and many other young men were educated by him for the ministry. The Synod of Philadelphia objected to his system of education as too superficial, and to the general spirit of evangelism which he fostered. At this time also occurred the great revival under Whitefield, in which he was mightily seconded by Gilbert Tennant, son of the pastor at Neshaming, and this great awakening brought to a point of rupture the strained feeling between the New Side and the Old Side, as the parties were called. In 1741, the Presbytery of New Brunswick seceded from the Synod of Philadelphia, and in 1745 the Presbytery of New York joined the Progressive party and organized an independent synod. In 1758 both parties buried their differences and came together. It is unnecessary to say that during the War of the Revolution the Presbyterian people and clergy stood as one man for independence. They rivaled the Baptists and Congregationalists in their patriotic zeal. After that began a period of magnificent development. With an educated and earnest ministry, the Church spread westward and southward, incorporating a large part of the intelligent and well-to-do classes. By the Plan of Union of 1801, the New England emigration to the West was swept into the bosom of the Presbyterian Church, and the Congregationalists, the other party in the plan, were virtually inhibited from the Eastern and Western states. But like the wooden horse within the gates of Troy, this arrangement, ostensibly so happy for the Presbyterians, portended danger. Multitudes of pastors, trained in the freer air of New England and in the theology of Andover and New Haven, were settled over Presbyterian churches. The Church was gradually growing away from the extreme Calvinism of the elder days. The Old School party, as the stricter element was called, became alarmed. They protested at the loosening of theological bonds. Their protests fell on heedless ears. Then they tried ecclesiastical discipline. They selected representative New School men. The trial of Lyman Beecher at Cincinnati, 1835, and of Albert Barnes at Philadelphia, 1830, for heresy, although fruitless in the efforts aimed at, precipitated the rupture of the Church. In May, 1837, the Old School party, being in a majority, cut off 3 of the synods of Western New York and 1 in Ohio. Impassioned agitation followed, and division resulted. The slave question was another wedge. In 1857 the Southern Assemblies, New School, withdrew and formed the United Synod of the Presbyterian Church, and in 1861 the Old School assemblies in the South left their relations in the North. The 2 seceding bodies united in 1863 in the great church now known as the Presbyterian Church in the United States. After 1862, fraternal intercommunion began between the 2 northern churches, and at length, November 12th, 1869, at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the Plan of Union was adopted. The first Union meeting was held at Philadelphia in May, 1870, amid the wildest rejoicings and the congratulations of all bodies of Christians. may the union between the Northern and Southern churches be not long delayed. An impending crisis in the trial of Professor Charles H. Briggs, of Union Theological Seminary, for alleged heretical views, bids likely to rival the famous trials of Beecher and Barnes in disastrous results to the peace of the Church. The Presbyterian Church has made an unrivaled record in educational work. The College of New Jersey, commonly called Princeton College, founded in 1746, is the mother of numerous schools of like character. No church in the country has done so much for theological scholarship. Her theological seminaries at Princeton, New Jersey, founded 1812, Auburn, New York, 1819, New York City, 1835, Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, 1827, Cincinnati, 1829, Chicago, 1830, and others, are not surpassed by any in the world. Men famous equally for learning and piety have shed luster on this representative American church. Archibald Alexander and his two sons, James Waddell and Joseph Addison, were an illustrious trio of scholars and saints whose influence has been perpetuated at Princeton by the Hodges, father and son. Edward Robinson, after Moses Stuart, has been thus far, perhaps, the greatest man in biblical scholarship in America. The Presbyterian Church has had a most salutary influence on the religious life and thought in the United States. No church has received higher honor, and that honor has been richly deserved for her work in education, theological literature, and public morality. The most recent movements are the Pan-Presbyterian Councils, congresses of all the Reformed churches throughout the world, which met in Edinburgh in 1877, in Philadelphia in 1880, in Belfast in 1884, and in London in 1888, and the Westminster Confession Revision movement, which has been heartily taken up by the Mother Church. A very conservative revision within the limits of Calvinism has already been submitted to the presbyteries for their endorsement or rejection. The more progressive men, dissatisfied with such a timid dealing with the venerable symbol, will be likely to content themselves with their own freedom of thought within the limits allowed by the liberal terms of subscription. End of chapter 10.